The mud of the town clung to everything, a thick, greasy soup that sucked at a man's boots and smelled of lye, stale whiskey, and animals. Dusk bled purple and gray into the sky, swallowing the sharp peaks of the mountains to the west and turning the street into a canyon of shadows. Luke Maddox kept his head down, his hat pulled low. He hated towns. He hated the noise, the press of bodies, the sour smell of men who hadn't seen clean water in a month. He was here for supplies, flour, coffee, cartridges, and then he meant to be gone, back to the high, cold silence of his homestead. He was tying a sack of beans to his saddle when he heard the laughter. It was a cruel, barking sound that snagged on the raw evening air. It came from the alley behind the Silver Horn Saloon, a place where men went to lose their pay, their teeth, or their lives. Luke was not a curious man. Curiosity was a weakness, like a bad back or a talkative nature. It got a man killed. He should have mounted his horse. He should have ridden out, but the sound was followed by a man's booming voice, thick with rot gut. "What am I bid for this fine piece of baggage, freshly delivered and ready for work?" More laughter. Luke's hand tightened on his saddle horn. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before in border towns where the law was just a rumor. It was none of his business. He had his own ghost to wrestle. He didn't need to take on anyone else's. He turned to leave, but something made him pause. A stillness. Through the gap between the saloon and the gunsmith's shop, he could see the small, lamp-lit crowd, maybe 20 men huddled in a rough circle, and in the center, on a crate, stood the baggage. It was a woman, or at least the shape of one. Her wrists were bound with rope to a post behind her. She was veiled, a scrap of dirty cloth covering her hair and face, and over her head, grotesquely, was a coarse burlap sack. It hung to her shoulders, stained with God knew what. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't crying or pleading. She was just standing there, as still as the stones under her feet. That stillness got under Luke's skin. It was wrong. It was the quiet of a rabbit in a snare, the frozen moment before the teeth snap shut. $1, shouted a miner, his voice cracking. "I'll give $1 for a poke." $1, the auctioneer, a big-bellied man with a greasy vest, boomed. "$1 silver for this mystery. She's got all her teeth, boys, and a fine shape under them rags. Who'll give me 2? Luke stayed in the shadows, his face a hard mask. He watched them leer and shove. These were broken men ground down by the frontier until nothing was left but ugly appetites. He'd come to pick up supplies, not to interfere in the sordid games of other men. He had a fence line to check before the snows came, and a barn roof that needed patching. This woman was not his concern. $1.50, cried another. "She might be ugly as a mud fence," someone yelled, and the crowd roared again. "Or she might be a beauty," the auctioneer countered. "That's the gamble, ain't it? Who's a gambling man tonight?" Luke felt a familiar, cold anger settle in his gut. It was the same feeling he got when he saw a man whip a horse half to death or a trapper leave a wolf to die in a trap. A useless, burning rage that had no good outlet. He'd learned long ago that stepping in only painted a target on his own back. He'd spent 5 years building a life where no one knew his name, a life of absolute, uncompromising solitude. He meant to keep it that way. The bidding stalled at $1.75. The auctioneer was getting frustrated. He walked over to the woman and poked her shoulder. She didn't flinch. "Come on, boys, she's breathing. What more do you want?" A man near the front, drunk and swaying, stumbled forward. "Let's see the goods. Pull that sack off her." The crowd surged with agreement. "Yeah, pull it off." The auctioneer grinned, showing broken yellow teeth. He reached for the hem of the burlap sack. Luke didn't know why he did it. The words were out of his mouth before he'd even thought them. They were quiet, but they cut through the drunken noise like a new blade. $2 silver. The crowd went silent. Every head turned. Luke stepped out of the alley's shadow. He didn't look at the woman. He looked at the auctioneer. The man's greasy grin faltered. He knew Luke. Not by name, but by sight. The quiet man who came in twice a season, bought his supplies with solid coin, and stared through anyone who tried to make small talk. He was the kind of man you didn't cross, not because he was loud, but because he was so completely quiet. "Well now," the auctioneer said, trying to regain his footing. $2 from the man in the back. Do I hear 2 1/4? 2 1/4. No one spoke. The miners and trappers shuffled their feet. The sport had been spoiled. The drunk man who had demanded to see her face now seemed to find his boots fascinating. Luke just stood there, his hand resting loosely near the worn wooden grip of his pistol. He didn't move. He just waited. $2 it is, the auctioneer grumbled, his voice losing its boom. "Sold. To you, Mr." Luke walked forward. The crowd parted for him, the men turning away, suddenly eager to get back to the saloon's warmth. He pulled 2 heavy coins from his pocket and dropped them into the auctioneer's sweaty palm. The man didn't meet his eyes. He just pocketed the money, untied the rope from the post, and shoved the damp, rough end into Luke's hand. "She's all yours." Luke took the rope. He gave the woman a slight tug. "Come on." She stumbled off the crate, her legs stiff. He led her through the mud, away from the sickly yellow light of the saloon. He didn't look back. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers starting up. He'd just broken his own first rule. He'd been noticed. He reached his horse. The mare nickered softly, smelling the stranger. The woman stood beside him, her head bowed, the sack still hiding her face. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder. He untied the rope from her wrists, his fingers brushing skin that was cold and raw. The rope burns were deep. He kept the rope, coiling it. He didn't know if she'd run. He put his hands on her waist. She weighed almost nothing. He lifted her easily, setting her sideways on the saddle. She made a small, choked sound, the first sound he'd heard from her, but she didn't fight. She just grabbed the saddle horn with one hand, her knuckles white. Luke swung up behind her, settling into the seat. He kicked the horse into a walk, and then a steady trot, leaving the town, the mud, and the noise behind them. He rode for almost an hour, heading north into the high country. The wind was rising, sharp and cold, carrying the first bite of winter. The woman sat rigid in front of him. She hadn't moved a muscle. He was holding a dead weight, a breathing corpse. He didn't know what he'd done. He'd spent $2, a week's worth of coffee, on a woman he didn't want, to solve a problem that wasn't his. He was a fool. He could feel the anger at himself, hot and sour. He pulled the horse to a stop in a grove of skeletal cottonwoods. The moon was rising, casting a pale, sick light over the land. It was time to see what he had bought. He dismounted. He stood in front of the horse, looking up at her. She was still clutching the saddle horn. "I'm taking that sack off," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of kindness. She flinched, a small, violent tremor that ran through her whole body. But she didn't resist. She just lowered her head. Luke reached up, his calloused fingers gripping the rough burlap. He hated the smell of it, mildew, sweat, and fear. He pulled it up and off. Her head was bowed, and a mass of dark, tangled hair fell forward. "Look at me," he said. It wasn't a request. Slowly, she lifted her head. Luke's breath caught in his chest. The auctioneer had said she might be a beauty. He hadn't been lying, but it was a beauty that was hard to look at. Her face was pale as skim milk, marked with the ugly, fading colors of a bruise that covered her jaw and cheek. Her bottom lip was split and swollen. Dirt was smeared across her forehead. She was a picture of rough handling and desperation. But her bones were fine, delicate as a bird's. And her eyes, God, her eyes. They were a deep, clear gray, like water over stone. And they were empty. Not scared, not angry, not defiant, just hollowed out. They were the eyes of someone who had looked into the void for so long. It had looked back and taken up residence. They were the most devastatingly beautiful, haunted things he had ever seen. They stared at each other in the cold moonlight. He felt a jolt, something unwelcome and sharp, deep in his gut. He was the one who had bought her, but in her gaze, he felt like the one being judged. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh. "What's your name?" She just looked at him. The wind whipped her hair across her bruised face. "I asked you your name, girl," he said, rougher than he meant to. Her split lip trembled. She swallowed, a painful, dry sound. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper, a sound like dry leaves scraping pavement. "Annalise." That was all. No last name, no explanation, just Annalise. Luke stared at her for another long moment. He felt the trap closing. He'd thought to solve a problem, and instead, he'd just bought himself a bigger one. He turned from her and busied himself checking the cinch on his saddle, his movements jerky and angry. "We ride north," he said, not looking at her. "My cabin's 2 days from here. Don't try to run. There's nothing out here but wolves and winter." He swung back up onto the horse, his body pressing against her back. She was trembling now, a fine, constant shiver that he could feel through his coat. He nudged the horse forward, and the darkness of the trail swallowed them whole. They rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only to water the horse and rest for an hour. Luke gave her a piece of hardtack and some dried jerky from his saddlebag. He untied the rope from his saddle and threw it into a ravine. He didn't need it. She wasn't going to run. She had nowhere to go. He watched her eat. She chewed slowly, wincing as the hard food touched her split lip. She ate like an animal, wary, her eyes never leaving him. He looked away, pretending to check the horizon. He offered his canteen. She drank, her hands shaking so much she spilled water down her chin. The chill deepened. The sky was a hard, flat gray. Snow was coming, and soon, Luke untied his heavy wool bedroll coat from the back of his saddle. "Put this on." She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the coat. "Take it," he snapped. "I'm not having you freeze to death on me." She took it, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was like ice. She pulled the coat on. It was huge on her, swallowing her small frame until only her pale, bruised face was visible. She huddled inside it, and the shivering subsided. Just a little. He said nothing more. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the plod of the horse and the whistle of the wind through the pines. He could smell her, the faint, clean scent of soap beneath the grime and the fear. He hated it. It was a complication. It was a reminder of a world he had left behind. His cabin was built into the base of a rocky hill, sheltered from the north wind by a stand of ancient spruce. It was small, just one room, with walls of thick-hewn logs and a sod roof. A thin trickle of smoke rose from the stone chimney. It was his fortress. No one came here, no one but him. And now, her. He dismounted and reached up for her. She slid down into his arms, and he was struck again by how light she was. She stumbled when her feet hit the ground, her legs numb from the long ride. He let go of her immediately, as if her skin burned him. "Go inside. Fire's banked." Annalise stopped at the doorway. She looked at the cabin, her eyes sweeping over the sparse interior, the single cot in the corner, the cold stone hearth, the rough table and one chair, the shelves of supplies. Her gaze landed on the cot, and she froze. A visible tremor ran through her, a fear so profound it was almost a sound. Luke saw it. He understood it. He sighed. The sound, a cloud of white in the frigid air. He pushed past her, dropping his saddlebags by the door with a heavy thud. "You take the cot," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her. He went to the hearth, stoked the embers, and added fresh wood. The fire caught, and light and warmth began to fill the small room. "I'll sleep on the floor." She didn't move from the doorway. "Get in and shut the door," he said, his back still to her. "You're letting the cold in." She did as she was told, slipping inside and pushing the heavy plank door shut. The bar fell into place with a solid, final thunk. She stood against the door, clutching the oversized coat around her, looking like a lost child. Luke ignored her. He made coffee, his movements economical and practiced. He sliced bacon into a pan and set it on the fire, the sizzle and smell filling the silence. He found a tin plate and cup and scraped a portion of bacon and beans onto it. He set it on the table. "Eat!" She crept toward the table. She sat on the lone chair and began to eat, her movements stiff, her eyes cast down. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the rising howl of the wind outside. Snow had begun to fall, small, hard pellets that ticked against the single glass window. When she was done, she took the plate to the wash basin, cleaned it, and set it to dry. She did it all without a word, like a well-trained servant, or a prisoner. Luke rolled his blankets out on the floor near the hearth, as far from her cot as he could get in the small space. He kept one blanket for himself. The others, he tossed onto the cot. "Get some sleep," he said. He turned his back to her, giving her what privacy he could. He lay down on the hard floor, his hand resting on the pistol he'd set beside him. He stared into the fire, listening. He heard the rustle of the cot, the soft sigh as she lay down. He heard her pull the blankets up, and then silence again. Luke didn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the storm and the quiet, alien breathing of the woman on his cot. He had brought the world's trouble right to his door. He closed his eyes, his jaw tight. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing coals. The cabin was cast in deep shadow. The storm raged. It was a scream that ripped him from his restless doze. Not a loud scream. It was choked off, a strangled sound of pure, abject terror. Luke was on his feet in an instant, his gun in his hand, his heart pounding against his ribs. He spun toward the cot. She was sitting bolt upright, fighting the blankets as if they were alive and trying to suffocate her. Her eyes were wide open, but blind, staring at something in the dark that he couldn't see. "No," she whispered, gasping for air. "Please, not again. Please, no more." She was trapped in the nightmare. Luke put the pistol down on the table. He moved toward her, his boots silent on the plank floor. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't a man given to comfort. He knew how to break a horse, how to set a trap, how to end a fight. He didn't know this. He reached the cot. She was trembling so hard the wooden frame rattled. He reached out, his hand large and rough, and put it on her shoulder. "You're safe," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from sleep. "It's just a dream. You're safe." The touch, the sound, it broke the spell. Her eyes focused. She saw him, and she shattered. She didn't cry out. She just collapsed. She folded in on herself, curling into a tight, small ball, her face buried in her knees. The sobs began. They were the most terrible sounds he had ever heard, because they were almost silent, just a deep, body-racking, hitching gasp for air as she cried into her own arms, trying to make no noise at all. Luke stood there, his hand still on her shoulder, feeling the desperate tremors run through her. He felt useless. He should go back to his blankets. He should leave her be. But he couldn't. Awkwardly, he sat on the edge of the cot. He didn't pull her close. He didn't stroke her hair. He just kept his hand on her shoulder, a heavy, solid weight, a human anchor in the middle of her storm. He said nothing else. There were no words for this. He sat there as she cried. He sat there as the sobs slowly quieted into hitched breaths, and then into the shallow breathing of exhausted sleep. He sat there as the storm outside wore itself out. He never moved. He just stayed by her side, his hand on her shoulder, watching the first cold gray light of dawn creep through the snowy window. He hadn't slept. He looked at the small, broken woman curled on his cot, and a cold dread, heavier than the snow, settled in his gut. He didn't know her name. Not really. He didn't know her past. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that whatever had been chasing her was not done yet, and he had just painted himself and his quiet cabin right into the center of it. The snow held for 3 days, a blinding white siege that locked the cabin in a deep and profound silence. Then the sky cleared, and a fragile sun revealed a world scrubbed clean and frozen solid. In this bright, cold quiet, a routine began to knit itself together, stitched with silence and necessity. Annalise moved through the small cabin like a ghost, a shadow with purpose. She woke before him, rekindling the fire from the embers he'd banked. She made coffee, the smell of it dark and strong in the small space. She cooked what he had: salt pork, beans, flatbread baked in the skillet. She swept the rough plank floor, her movements economical and soundless. She did all this without being asked, as if following a script written for her long ago. But she did not speak, not a word since she had whispered her name in the moonlight. She was a presence, not a person. Her strength returned slowly. The sickly, pale color of her skin gave way to a faint flush from the hearth's heat, and the terrible bruises on her face faded from purple and black to a sickly yellow, then vanished, leaving her skin smooth and unblemished. But the mark on her lip, the small, puckered scar where it had been split, remained. Luke left her be. He didn't ask questions. He didn't press her for a past he was not sure he wanted to know. He felt her silence as a physical thing, a wall she carried with her. He gave her space, moving out of the cabin at dawn and returning only at dusk. His days filled with the hard, solitary labor of survival. He checked his trap lines, reset snares, and began the long, aching work of chopping enough wood to last them through the deep winter he knew was settling in. He watched her, though. He watched her when she didn't know he was looking. He saw how she flinched. The sharp crack of his axe splitting a log would make her jump, her hand flying to her chest, her eyes wide with a momentary, hunted terror. The sound of him clearing his throat, the metallic snick of him chambering a round into his rifle before he left. Each small, sudden noise would draw a line of tension down her spine. He noticed her hands. She had taken one of his old flannel shirts from his chest, and she wore it constantly. The sleeves rolled and re-rolled, but still hanging past her wrists. She never pushed them up, not even when she washed the plates in the basin, not even when her hands were deep in flour for the bread. She kept her wrists hidden, as if they held a secret she could not bear to see, and he saw how she avoided her own reflection. The cabin had one mirror, a small square of clouded glass he'd nailed by the door for shaving. She never looked at it. She would turn her head when she passed it, her gaze fixed on the floor. She would wash her face in the basin, her eyes closed, feeling for the soap and the cloth by touch alone. It was as if she could not stand the sight of the woman who inhabited her own skin. Luke said nothing. He just stacked the wood, cleaned his rifle, and kept his own silence. He had his own ghosts. He had his own routines. He had slept on the floor every night since she arrived, and every night he lay awake for an hour, listening to her breathe in the dark, a small, fragile sound in the vast, cold wilderness. One morning, the sun was sharp and the air had a brittle edge. The snow had melted back from the south-facing pasture, leaving the ground hard and an ugly brown. Luke was working on the fence line that separated his small horse pasture from the endless forest. The top rail on one section had been split by a falling branch, and he was working to replace it. His mare, a bay named Dusty, was skittish. The cold made her blood run hot, and the smell of wolf, faint but present on the wind, made her dance and pull at her rope. "Settle," Luke murmured, pulling a new rail into place. "It's just the cold." He was holding the rail steady with one hand, his hammer in the other, his back to the horse. He didn't see her spook. Maybe it was a rabbit breaking cover, or a shadow that moved too fast. The mare reared, her tether rope snapping with a sound like a pistol shot. Her hooves lashed out. Luke heard the snap and turned. He wasn't fast enough. He saw the flash of iron-shod hoof. He tried to twist away, but it caught him square in the chest, on his left side. The force of it threw him back against the fence post he had just set. He heard and felt a crack. It wasn't the wood. It was him. A white-hot pain exploded in his ribs. The air was driven from his lungs in a single, agonizing gasp. He slid down the post, landing hard in the frozen mud. He couldn't breathe. He could only see black spots dancing in front of his eyes as he fought to pull in a single thread of air. He heard a scream. It was high and thin, a sound of pure panic. It was her. He forced his eyes open. Annalise was running from the cabin, stumbling through the mud and patches of old snow. She wasn't wearing shoes, only the thick wool socks he'd given her. Her hair was unbound, flying behind her like a dark banner. Her face was a mask of terror. She reached him, falling to her knees beside him in the mud. "Luke!" she gasped. It was the first time she had said his name. Her voice was raw. "Oh, God! Luke!" He finally managed to drag in a ragged, shallow breath. The pain was dizzying. "Ribs," he grunted, closing his eyes against the wave of blackness. "Just ribs." "We have to get you inside." Her hands hovered over him, shaking, terrified to touch him. "Help me up." He gritted his teeth and reached for the fence post, trying to pull himself up. The movement sent a fresh wave of fire through his side. He fell back, a low groan escaping his lips. "No, wait!" Her panic suddenly sharpened into focus. She looked less like a ghost and more like a cornered animal, forced to fight. "Lean on me. Put your arm over me." She slipped under his arm, her small shoulder bracing his weight. She was stronger than she looked. With a shared, grunting effort, he managed to get his feet under him. Every breath was a fresh stab of pain. They began the long, slow walk back to the cabin. It was only 50 yards, but it felt like a mile. He leaned heavily on her, his arm draped over her shoulder, his side screaming with every step. He could feel her trembling beneath his weight, but her legs were steady. She didn't falter. She just kept moving, her breath coming in small, determined puffs of white in the cold air. They reached the door. She kicked it open and half-carried, half-dragged him inside. He collapsed onto the cot she had been sleeping on. He lay there, sweating and breathing in shallow, careful gasps. Annalise stood over him for a moment, her chest heaving. Then she was in motion. She grabbed his knife from his belt. He tensed, his hand instinctively going to his side, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at his shirt. "This has to come off," she said. Her voice was still shaky, but it was firm. She sliced the buttons off his thick flannel shirt, her movements quick and efficient. She peeled the wet, muddy cloth away from his skin. He winced as she touched his side. "I know," she whispered. "I know." She ran her fingers lightly over his ribs, her touch surprisingly gentle. He sucked in a breath when she found the spot. "It's broken," she said. "Maybe 2 of them." He'd come to the same conclusion. "Get the whiskey in the crate." She fetched the bottle and a strip of clean cloth. She poured some of the amber liquid onto the rag and began to clean the mud and blood from a scrape where the hoof had grazed him. Her hands were steady now. The terror was gone, replaced by a grim competence. "You'll need binding," she said. She looked around the cabin, her eyes landing on a clean linen sheet he kept in his chest. Without asking, she took it and tore it into long, wide strips. "This will hurt," she said. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. "Get on with it." She had him sit up, his back against the wall. He bit down on a piece of leather from his saddlebag as she worked. She wrapped the linen strips around his chest, pulling each one tight, tighter than he thought she was capable of. The pressure was excruciating. But he knew it was necessary. It would hold the ribs in place. When she was done, he was sweating and pale, but he could breathe a little easier, the sharp edges of the pain momentarily dulled by the compression. She helped him lie back down. She pulled his boots off, her movements impersonal and practiced. She covered him with the blankets. "Rest," she said. She turned away and began to clean up the mess, her hands shaking again, the adrenaline leaving her. Luke lay there, his body aching, and watched her. The ghost was gone. In her place was a woman who had run shoeless into the snow, who knew the look of a broken bone, and who could bind a man's ribs without flinching. He had saved her from an alley, and now, in her own way, she had just saved him. The debt between them had shifted, and the air in the small cabin crackled with a new, unspoken weight. The next few days were a blur of pain for Luke. He was trapped on the cot, his world reduced to the 4 log walls and the ceiling. He was not a good patient. The stillness chafed at him, made him angry and restless. He hated being weak. He hated being dependent. And he was, for the first time in his life, completely dependent on Annalise. She tended to him with a quiet efficiency. She brought him broth, holding the cup to his lips when his hands shook. She kept the fire blazing, the warmth a dull comfort against his aching side. She sat on the hearth, mending his torn shirt, the one she had cut from his body. The tension in the cabin, which had been a low hum, now became a palpable thing. The space was too small. Her presence was too large. He would wake in the middle of the day and find her watching him, her gray eyes unreadable. When she changed the dressing on his grays, her fingers would brush his skin, and a jolt would pass between them, sharp and surprising. They spoke, but only in necessary fragments. "More water. The fire needs wood. How is the pain?" "It's fine," he would growl, even when it wasn't. The long silences, however, were what truly brewed the storm. They would sit for hours, he on the cot, she by the fire, the only sound the pop and hiss of the logs. He would watch the firelight play on her face, on the curve of her neck. He found himself cataloging the details of her, the small scar on her lip, the way a few strands of dark hair always escaped her braid, the absolute stillness of her hands when she was lost in thought. He was a man who had chosen solitude, who had built a fortress against the world, and now a woman with haunted eyes was inside his walls. On the 4th night, the pain in his ribs had settled into a deep, grinding ache. He had finally fallen into a restless sleep, his mind drifting into the dark, familiar places it went when he was unguarded. He was back in El Paso. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap perfume. Gunfire. The sound was deafening, echoing in the cramped cantina. He saw the flash of a blade, the wide, terrified eyes of the girl, Maria. Her name was Maria. He was shouting. He was raising his pistol. The man with the knife turned, his face a snarl. Luke fired and fired again. The screams. Not just the girl's. His own. Luke woke with a violent jerk, his own name a strangled cry on his lips. He was tangled in his blankets, his body slick with a cold sweat, his heart hammered against his bound ribs, sending a fresh spike of pain through him. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to red coals. "You're all right?" Her voice came from the darkness, quiet and close. He blinked, his eyes adjusting. She was sitting on the floor beside the cot, just as she had that first night, a small, dark shape in the shadows. She must have been sitting there for some time. "It was just a dream," she said. He fought to control his breathing. The ghosts of the cantina were still clinging to him. He felt exposed, weak. Yes, a bad one." She didn't move. She just sat there, a silent witness to his terror. He felt a sudden, sharp kinship with her. He had seen her nightmare. Now she had seen his. Slowly, her hand moved through the darkness. She didn't touch him, not at first. She just laid her hand on the blanket that covered his chest. Then her fingers found his hand. She didn't grab it, she just covered it. Her palm was small and cool. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of understanding. It was the touch of someone who knew what it meant to wake up screaming. He didn't pull away. He simply lay there, his large, calloused hand under her small, cool one, and let his racing heart slow down. They stayed like that in the dark, two broken people sharing a silence that was, for the first time, not empty, but full. The next night, the intimacy of that shared nightmare hung in the air between them. The storm had passed. Luke was sitting in the cabin's lone chair, his ribs throbbing, a cup of whiskey in his hand. He was healing, but the cabin still felt like a cage. Annalise was on the hearth, staring into the flames. She had been quiet all day, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not empty, it was a heavy, thoughtful silence. The fire crackled, filling the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low he almost didn't hear it. "He told me I was going to be a companion, to his wife." Luke's hand tightened on his cup. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the floor. He knew, instinctively, that if he looked at her, she would stop. His name was Masterson, from back east, Philadelphia. She spoke to the fire. Not to him. Her voice was flat, reciting a story she had told herself 1,000 times. He was refined. He spoke kindly. He said his wife was lonely, out on the prairie. He said I was well bred for an orphan. He paid for my passage. She paused, taking a shaky breath. There was no wife. There was just a house, miles from any town, and a locked door. Luke closed his eyes. The whiskey in his cup was bitter on his tongue. He could picture it, the fine words, the kind smile, the click of the lock. He kept me there for almost a year. He said I was his investment. He said I had to be taught, to be obedient. He liked it when I cried. Luke's knuckles were white. The tin cup in his hand began to bend under the pressure. A low, cold rage, different from the hot anger of his nightmares, began to build in his gut. It was a desire to find this man, this Masterson, and to simply take him apart. "I tried to run," Annalise whispered, her voice cracking. "Twice. The second time, he caught me by the river. He said I was damaged goods. He said I had disobeyed. He said an investment that doesn't pay out must be sold off." She was crying now, silent tears that traced paths through the soot on her cheeks. "He brought me to that town. He sold me to the man at the saloon. He put the sack over my head himself. He said I didn't even deserve a face anymore." The cup in Luke's hand crumpled. Whiskey spilled over his knuckles. The sting of it nothing compared to the fury burning in his chest. The air in the cabin was thick, suffocating. He wanted to smash something. He wanted to ride out and find this man. He wanted to kill him. Annalise must have heard the metal groan, or felt the violence radiating from him. She turned from the fire, her tear-streaked face pale in the light. She saw the look on his face, the murderous set of his jaw. She uncurled herself from the hearth and moved toward him. She stood before his chair, hesitant. She saw his crushed cup, the whiskey dripping from his hand, tentatively. She reached out. Her small, trembling fingers brushed the back of his hand, the one clenched in a white-knuckled fist. The touch was like a flame. It was too much. It was too tender for the cold, hard rage he was holding. He pulled his hand back, a sharp, violent jerk. The chair scraped on the floor. Annalise flinched as if he had struck her. The light in her eyes died, replaced by the familiar, haunted emptiness. She thought his anger was for her. She thought he was disgusted. She saw him as just another man pulling away. She backed away, her hands clutching each other at her waist. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't," he growled, his voice rough. He stood up, the pain in his ribs flaring. He couldn't look at her. He felt ashamed of his rage and ashamed of his reaction. Annalise just shook her head, a look of profound, devastating hopelessness settling on her features. She was backing toward the cot, back to her safe wall of silence. "I don't want to be scared forever," she whispered, so quietly it was barely a breath. She was looking at him, her gray eyes wide and desperate. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. Before Luke could process it, before he could say a word, she moved. She crossed the small space between them in 2 steps. She wasn't backing away anymore. She put her cold hands on his shoulders, stood on her toes, and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not a kiss of love. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated desperation. It was the kiss of a drowning woman. Her lips were cold and chapped, and they pressed against his with a frantic, clumsy force. It was a raw, human plea for contact, for anything other than the cold emptiness she had lived in. Luke stood frozen. His mind was blank. The rage was gone, replaced by a sudden, shocking awareness of her. The smell of wood smoke in her hair, the feeling of her small, trembling hands on his shoulders, the desperate, clumsy pressure of her mouth. He didn't move. He didn't respond. He didn't breathe. The kiss lasted only a second. She felt his stillness, his lack of response. It was the answer she expected. She pulled back, her face stricken, a flush of deep, burning shame rising in her cheeks. She had offered the only thing she had, and he had not wanted it. Without a word, she turned from him. She walked to the cot, her back straight and rigid. She lay down, her face to the wall, and pulled the blankets up over her head, disappearing completely. Luke stood in the middle of the room, his hands still clenched, his ribs aching. The fire popped, a loud, sudden sound in the deafening silence. He could still feel the cold, desperate press of her lips. He raised his fingers to his mouth. His whole world, the one he had built so carefully, tilting and beginning to fall apart. The morning after the kiss was a new kind of cold. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with the sharp, jagged edges of what had happened. Annalise had risen before dawn, as she always did, and rebuilt the fire. When Luke stirred on the cot, the pain in his ribs a dull, angry throb. The coffee was already brewing. He watched her move in the gray light. She did not look at him. She did not speak. Her movements were stiff, her back a rigid line of shame. He had not slept. He had lain in the dark for hours, replaying that desperate, clumsy kiss. He had felt her shame as she pulled away, sharp as a physical blow. He had wanted to say something, to tell her. What? That he was not disgusted, that he was just a man made of old scars and new confusion. He had said nothing, and in his silence, he had confirmed her worst fears. He had become just like all the others. He sat up, grunting against the pain, and swung his legs over the side of the cot. Annalise flinched at the sound, her shoulders drawing in. She was at the table, her back to him, kneading dough for the day's bread. "It's snowing," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice she had used when she first arrived. The ghost was back. Luke looked at the window. She was right. Thick, heavy flakes were drifting past the glass, fat and wet. It was not the light, powdery snow of the high peaks. This was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It did not stop for a week. The world shrank to the 4 log walls. The wind howled, a constant, mournful sound that scraped at the corners of the cabin. The snow piled up, burying the window until only the top few inches showed a sliver of gray light. It drifted against the door, sealing them in. Each morning, Luke had to shove the door open with his shoulder, grunting against the pain in his side, just to carve a narrow path to the woodpile in the outhouse. They were trapped, not just by the storm, but by the choking intimacy of the small space. Luke's ribs healed, but the process was slow and aggravating. He was a man built for motion, and the confinement wore him raw. He was irritable, his temper short. He snapped at her once, when she dropped a log by the fire, the sound making him jump. "Be more careful," he'd growled. She had frozen, her face pale. She hadn't cried. She had just looked at him with those hollowed-out eyes, given a small, jerky nod, and moved away. The look on her face made him feel lower than a snake. He'd wanted to apologize, but the words felt like stones in his throat. Annalise retreated so far into herself she was barely there. She cooked, she mended, she slept on her pallet of blankets on the floor, curled as far from his cot as she could get. But the cabin was only 12 feet by 12 feet. There was no escape. They moved around each other like wary animals, bound by the shared chores of survival. She would hand him the heavy pot, her fingers brushing his, and both would flinch, pulling back as if burned. They ate their meals in silence, the only sounds the scraping of spoons on tin plates and the relentless scream of the wind. The silence about the kiss stretched, becoming a barrier as solid as the snowdrifts outside. After 9 days, the storm finally broke. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. The world was buried in white. Luke stood at the door, looking out at a landscape that was smooth, alien, and deadly. "The roof," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She came to stand beside him. The sod roof was piled with at least 4 feet of heavy, wet snow. "It won't hold," he said. "It has to be cleared." It was brutal, exhausting work. His ribs were not healed, not nearly. He couldn't climb. He gave her the shovel, and with a rope tied around her waist, he boosted her up. She was light, but strong, and she set to work, her face grim. She shoveled, and he stood below, bracing himself as she pushed the heavy curtains of snow over the edge, where they fell with a muffled whump. It took all day. By the time the sky began to purple with dusk, she was trembling with exhaustion, and his side was a bonfire of fresh agony. They ate their dinner of beans and salt pork. Annalise was covered in sweat and melted snow. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands. She was staring into her plate, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold her spoon. Luke watched her. He saw the grime on her neck, the soot on her hands. He thought of the bath she had tried to take in the basin, scrubbing at her skin with cold water and harsh lye soap. He thought of the filth of that auction, of the man who had called her an investment. He stood up, his joints popping, and went to the large storage chest in the corner. He pulled out a large, round tin tub, one he used for laundry in the summer and for processing feed. He set it on the floor near the hearth. Annalise's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. What are you doing?" Luke didn't answer. He took the largest cauldron, filled it with snow from the drift by the door, and set it on the fire to melt. Then the next one, and the next. It took over an hour of heavy lifting that made his ribs scream, an hour of silence while Annalise watched him, her hands clenched in her lap. Finally, the water was hot. He poured the steaming cauldrons into the tub, one after another, until it was half full. The cabin filled with a thick, damp steam, a welcome humidity in the dry, cold air. He went to his own chest and pulled out a small, wrapped bar of soap. Not the harsh lye. This was pine soap, something he'd bought from a traveling tinker 2 summers ago and never used. He set it on the stool beside the tub, along with a clean linen cloth. He turned to her. She was pressed against the far wall, her face pale, her eyes darting between him and the tub. "It's for you," he said. His voice was quiet. She stared at him, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. A bath. It was an act of profound vulnerability. It meant undressing. It meant being naked, in this room, with him. The terror on her face was so profound he could almost taste it. "Go on," he said. He did not move toward her. "The water will get cold." I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. Not with you here." "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice flat. "There's nowhere to go. The snow's 10 feet deep and it's dark." He pointed to the door. "And I'm not leaving you in here with the door unbarred." Her face crumpled. She saw it as a trap. Luke sighed, the sound rough. He walked to the small table and sat down in the lone chair. He turned it so his back was completely to the tub and the hearth. He faced the cold, dark window. "I will not look," he said. "I give you my word, but I am staying in this room. You're safe. Now take your bath." He heard her move, the sound of her bare feet on the plank floor. He heard her hesitate. He stared out the window, at his own faint reflection in the dark glass. He saw the rigid line of his own shoulders. The cabin was silent, save for the pop of the fire. Then, he heard the sound of cloth rustling, a soft sigh, and then a gentle splash as she stepped into the water. The tension in the room was unbearable. It was thicker than the steam. Luke's hands gripped his knees. He could hear her moving, the small sounds of her washing. He heard her gasp, just once, as the hot water eased the ache in her muscles. He pictured her in his mind, her pale skin, the curve of her back, her hair pinned up. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the image away. He was not that man. He would not be that man. He sat there, his back a rigid wall of pained muscle, and guarded her. Not from the world outside, but from the ghosts in her own head. It might have been 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. He lost track of time. He just sat and listened to the quiet, intimate sounds of her bathing. "Finally," her voice came, small and hesitant. I'm finished." "Dry yourself and get dressed," he said, his voice rough. "By the fire. It's warm there." He didn't turn around. He waited, listening to the drip of water, the rustle of cloth. "I'm dressed," she said. Only then did he stand. He turned. She was sitting on the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, her clean, damp hair hanging loose over her shoulders. She was combing it with her fingers. Her face was flushed pink from the heat. She looked younger, softer. She wouldn't meet his eyes. He picked up the tub, his ribs screaming in protest, and dumped the gray water out the front door. The tension wire between them had been pulled so taut, he was sure it would snap. It snapped 3 nights later. A new storm had blown in, this one colder, sharper, bringing a wind that sounded like a freight train trying to tear the cabin from its foundation. Luke was restless. His ribs ached with the changing pressure. Annalise was quiet, but her eyes kept straying to the roof. It happened just after midnight. Luke was dozing on the cot, Annalise on her pallet. The sound was not a groan. It was a crack, sharp and explosive, like a rifle shot inside the cabin. They were both on their feet. A fine powder of snow and sod was raining down from the ceiling. One of the main support beams, the one they had braced, had split clean in 2. The roof was visibly sagging in the middle. "Get your coat!" Luke yelled. Grabbing his own, he snatched his axe from the corner and shoved the door open. The wind tore it from his hand, slamming it back against the wall. Snow and ice blasted into the room, extinguishing the lantern. "The spare beam!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. "It's by the woodpile." They scrambled outside. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole their breath. The wind was a solid wall, trying to push them over. They fought their way to the woodpile. The spare beam was there. Heavy, seasoned oak. It was frozen to the ground. Luke hacked at the ice with his axe, his ribs sending white-hot signals of agony up his side. "Help me!" Annalise put her shoulder next to his. They heaved. The log was immense, easily 300 pounds. On a good day, it was a hard lift for him alone. Injured, it was impossible. With her, it was just barely possible. They half lifted, half dragged it through the deepening drift, fighting the wind, which tried to tear the log from their frozen hands. They got it inside, the cabin now almost as cold as the outdoors. The fire was down to sputtering coals. "We have to wedge it," Luke gasped, his breath pluming. He pointed. They had to lift the massive beam over their heads, to brace the failing roof. He knew, even as he said it, that it was hopeless, but they had to try. He positioned himself under the broken beam. "On 3, lift!" They shoved. The log moved 6 inches. Luke roared, a sound of pure, desperate effort. The pain in his side so white-hot he almost blacked out. The log would not budge further. "Again!" They tried again and again. Snow poured in from the failing roof. It was useless. They were too weak. The roof was too heavy. Annalise let go. Her arms dropped to her sides. She was soaked in sweat, which was already freezing to her skin. She was shivering so violently her teeth chattered. "We can't," she whispered, the words lost in the wind. "Luke, we can't." He stared at the sagging roof. She was right. He let the beam thud to the floor. It was over. The cabin would go. They would freeze before morning. He looked at Annalise. She was swaying on her feet, her face sheet white, her lips turning blue. The exhaustion, the terror, the profound, biting cold. It had taken all of her strength. I'm so cold," she stammered. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a strange, detached surprise. And then, as if her strings had been cut, she collapsed. She didn't fall. She just folded, landing in a heap on the snow-dusted floor. A new, cold terror, sharper than the wind, cut through Luke. He forgot his ribs. He forgot the roof. He scooped her up from the floor. She was frighteningly light. Her clothes were soaked, her body already going stiff. He carried her to the cot. He threw the snow-covered blankets to the floor. "Annalise!" he shouted, shaking her. She didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. He knew what this was. He had seen it in the high country. It was the deep cold, the kind that steals a life before you even know it's gone. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy. He tore at the wet laces of her boots, pulling them from her numb feet. He unbuttoned her frozen coat, her wet flannel shirt. His hands were clumsy, numb, but he didn't stop. He stripped her of every wet, frozen garment until she was naked. He grabbed the last dry wool blanket from his chest and wrapped her in it, but he knew it wasn't enough. He needed heat, body heat. He ripped off his own shirt, his skin instantly prickling in the freezing air of the cabin. He didn't hesitate. He kicked off his boots, climbed into the narrow cot, and pulled her stiff, cold body against his. He wrapped his arms and legs around her, enveloping her, and pulled the dry blankets up over both of them, tucking them in tight, creating a small, desperate cocoon of shared space. She was like ice, a dead, cold weight in his arms. "Don't you die," he growled into her hair, his voice fierce. "You hear me? You are not dying here." He began to rub her. He rubbed her back, her arms, her legs, his calloused hands moving with a rough, urgent friction, trying to force life back into her limbs. He held her so tightly his own aching ribs protested, but he ignored it. He held her for an hour, or maybe 2. The wind howled, the roof groaned. He didn't care. His only focus was the woman in his arms. Slowly, agonizingly, he felt a change, a tremor. It started in her chest, a faint, shuddering vibration. Then it grew. She began to shiver. It was not the light trembling from before. This was a deep, violent, bone-rattling series of shudders. He held her tighter, anchoring her. "That's it," he whispered, his lips against her temple. "Fight it! You fight it!" The shivering began to subside. He felt her move. She was not just a cold weight anymore. She was a person. He felt her breath, shallow but regular, against his chest. She made a small, confused sound. She was waking up. He felt her body tense. She was becoming aware of the dark, aware of the cold, aware that she was naked, aware that a man's naked arms were wrapped around her. She went rigid. A small, terrified sound, half sob, half scream, caught in her throat. "Shh," Luke said, his voice low and steady, right by her ear. "You're safe. It's just me. You were freezing. I had to get you warm." She was still tense, trembling with a new, different fear. He could feel the panic rising in her. "You don't touch me like they did," she whispered. The words were a wisp of air, so quiet he almost didn't hear them over the wind. It was a question, a plea, and a memory, all at once. He held her, his grip firm, but not bruising. He did not move his hands, he just held her. "I'm not them," he said. His voice was a low, rough promise in the dark. That was it, the words. He felt the last of the tension bleed out of her. The trembling didn't stop, but it changed. It was no longer fear. It was something else. She let out a long, shuddering breath, and then, slowly, she moved. She didn't pull away. She pressed closer. She burrowed her face into the curve of his neck, her cold nose touching his warm skin. Her small, trembling hand, which had been trapped between their chests, slid up. Her fingers spread out over his heart. He felt the shift. This was no longer just for warmth. This was a choice. He lowered his head. He found her mouth in the dark. It was not the desperate, clumsy kiss from before. This was tentative, a question. He kissed her gently, his lips brushing hers. She kissed him back. A small, trembling response. It was all the answer he needed. There were no more words. The wind was the only sound. His hands, which had been rough and urgent, now gentled. He moved his hand from her back to her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, the small scar on her lip. She turned into his touch, her own hand moving from his chest to his shoulder. It was a slow, unfolding discovery. It was tentative. He was terrified of frightening her, of moving too fast. She was terrified of everything. But the terror was now mixed with a new, sharp and hungry need. She had been touched by violence for so long. This was the first touch of simple, wanting kindness. His kiss deepened. It was a kiss of pain and comfort, a raw acknowledgement of the broken pieces they both were. He tasted the salt of her near death on her skin. She tasted the whiskey and the loneliness on his. It was a hunger, not just of the body, but of the soul, a desperate human need to not be alone, to be held, to be wanted not as property, but as a person. He moved, shifting his weight, his injured side forgotten. He covered her body with his hands mapping the delicate shape of her. She trembled, but she did not pull away. She arched against him, a silent, wordless yes. Their joining was not a clash. It was a quiet, desperate merging. It was trembling and emotional. It was clumsy and real. It was two people, scarred and solitary, finding a fragile, breathing warmth in the middle of a deadly storm. In the dark, cold cabin, as the wind screamed and the roof threatened to collapse above them, they found a shelter in each other. Afterward, he held her. He pulled the blankets tight around them. He lay on his back, and she lay curled against his side, her head on his shoulder. The cabin was quiet, save for their breathing and the dying wind. And then she began to cry. It was not the silent, terrified sobbing of her nightmares. This was a storm, a deluge, racking, heartbroken sobs that tore from her throat. It was a year of locked doors. It was the auction block. It was the terror of the cold. It was the overwhelming, agonizing relief of being, for the first time, truly safe. Luke did not speak. He did not tell her to be quiet. He did not offer empty words. He just held her. He wrapped both arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest, and let her break. He anchored her as her storm finally broke. He held her until the sobs quieted into ragged breaths, and she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep in his arms. Annalise woke to silence, a bright, piercing silence. Light was streaming into the cabin, not just from the window, but from the gaping hole in the roof. The storm was over. She was alone in the cot. She was warm, tucked deep into the blankets. Her clothes, dried by the fire, were folded neatly on the chair beside her. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed it. The cold, the roof, the feel of his arms around her. Then she heard it. Thwack! 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 She sat up. The cabin was cold, but the fire was built high, blazing in the hearth. She dressed quickly, pulling on the dry clothes, her body aching, but alive. She went to the window. Luke was outside. The world was a sea of glittering, blinding white. He was standing in snow up to his hips, attacking a fallen pine tree. He was coatless, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his suspenders hanging by his waist. He was splitting logs with a savage, rhythmic energy. Thwack, thwack, thwack. He was working like a man possessed, steam rising from his back and shoulders in the frigid air. She watched him for a long time. Then she pulled on her boots and coat and went outside. The cold hit her, but it was a clean, sharp cold now, not the damp, killing wind of the night. She waded through the drift toward him. "Luke," she said. He didn't stop. Thwack! The axe head buried itself in the wood. "Luke," she said again, louder. He stopped, his arm mid-swing. He stood breathing heavily, his head down. He wouldn't look at her. "You should be inside," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your hands," she said. He looked down at his hands on the axe handle, as if noticing them for the first time. He had gripped the axe so hard, and his skin was so cold, he had split his knuckles open. Blood was smeared on the wooden handle, frozen black in the cold. He hadn't even felt it. She walked up to him. She took the axe from his numb, unresisting grip. "Come inside," she said. It was not a request. He followed her, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had been in a fight and lost. Inside, she sat him on the chair. She took the basin and filled it with warm water from the kettle. She knelt in front of him. She took his large, bloody hands in hers and submerged them in the water. He hissed as the warmth hit the raw skin. She washed them, gently. She cleaned the blood and the dirt and the pine resin from his split knuckles. He just sat there, staring at the top of her head as she worked. "I had to," he whispered, his voice thick. "I know," she said, not looking up. He stared at her bent head, the dark, clean hair. He had to tell her. After last night, after holding her, he had to give her the truth. All of it. "I killed a man once," he said. Her hands stopped moving for a second. Then she resumed, dabbing his knuckles with a clean cloth. "I know you said that you shot a man," she whispered. "In your nightmare." "No," he said. "I mean, I killed him. In El Paso, 5, maybe 6 years ago." He took a shaky breath. "He was hurting a child, a saloon girl. But she wasn't. She wasn't more than 12. He had her cornered. He had a knife. I shot him, and I kept shooting. I emptied my gun into him." He stared at his hands, now clean, in her grasp. I'm not a good man, Annalise. There's a violence in me. I felt it this morning. I wanted to just hit something until it broke." He looked at her, his eyes full of a pain that had nothing to do with his ribs. "I wanted you to know what I am." She finished drying his hands. She looked up at him. Her clear, gray eyes were steady. There was no fear in them. Not anymore. She held his gaze. "I'd have done the same," she said. She let go of one of his hands. With her other, she traced the line of his jaw. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. That night, the storm was gone. The world was quiet. The stars were brilliant, cold points of light, visible through the hole in their roof. They ate their dinner, the silence between them easy, comfortable. When it was time to sleep, There was no hesitation. He didn't move to the floor. She didn't curl up alone. They lay down on the narrow cot together. He pulled the blankets over them, and she curled into his side, her head resting on his chest. Her small hand splayed over his heart. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Outside, the world was frozen and broken. But inside the ruined cabin, for the first time in either of their lives, they were warm, and they were not alone. The first sound of the thaw was water. It was not the gentle sound of a spring rain, but the steady, relentless drip, drip, drip of the world unfreezing. For months, the snow and ice had been their fortress, a thick white wall that had sealed them off from the world. The silence of deep winter had been their cocoon, but now the walls were melting. Luke had fixed the roof, replacing the split beam with the heavy oak they had fought to bring inside. He had worked with a grim, focused energy, his mended ribs still pulling, but his strength returned. Annalise had helped, passing him the tools, holding the timbers. They worked together with the easy, unspoken rhythm of two people who had shared a single, narrow cot through the coldest nights of the season. The cabin was no longer a cage, it was a home. With the melt came the first signs of life. The suffocating white retreated, exposing the brown, matted grass of the small pasture. The creek below the cabin began to roar, swollen with melted snow, and Annalise, too, began to thaw. The woman Luke had bought was gone. The hollow-eyed, silent ghost who flinched at every sound had been replaced by someone new. The weeks of regular food, venison stew, fresh bread, hot coffee had put weight on her small frame. Her cheeks, once pale and sunken, were now fuller, and a healthy flush colored her skin. Her hair, which she now washed and braided every morning by the fire, shone dark and healthy. Her eyes, those clear gray eyes, were no longer haunted and empty. They were bright. When she smiled, a small, shy curving of her mouth he had come to crave. The scar on her lip was just a part of her, not a mark of her past. She laughed once. Luke had been trying to snare a rabbit, and had instead caught his own boot, tumbling backward into a patch of slushy mud. He had sat there, covered in filth, and heard a sound from the cabin doorway. It was a light, clear sound, like a bell. She had her hand over her mouth, her eyes sparkling. He had stared at her, his heart giving a painful lurch, and had found himself smiling back, the mud dripping from his hat. They had settled into a life. It was a hard life, one of shared burdens and small comforts. They moved around each other in the small space with an intimacy that was as physical as a touch. A hand on his arm as she passed him, the way he would tuck a stray piece of hair behind her ear. They still slept curled together in the narrow cot, their bodies fitted to each other, a solid warmth in the damp, cold nights. But as the snow melted, the fear returned. It was different now. She no longer feared him. She did not flinch when he moved too quickly, or when his voice was rough. But the sounds from outside, they made her freeze. The snap of a twig in the woods, the distant cry of a hawk, the sound of a horse, his own horse, stamping in the night. Luke watched her. He saw her standing at the open cabin door for long stretches, not admiring the coming spring, but scanning the ridgeline to the south. The bright, clear look in her eyes would cloud over, and she would grow distant, her mind miles away, back in a place he could not reach. Her old habits returned. He saw her rubbing her wrists, her fingers tracing the faint, pale lines of the rope burns that had long since healed. The spring was not a promise of new life to her. It was a threat. The melting snow meant the trails were passable. The fortress was gone. The world could find her again. He knew she was thinking of Masterson. One afternoon, Luke rode out, his rifle in its scabbard. The thaw meant he had to check the perimeter of his land, to see what damage the winter had done to his fences, to look for signs of wolves or mountain cats drawn by the smell of his horse. He rode south, following the game trail that led, eventually, back toward the town he had pulled her from. He found it nailed to a thick pine tree, 3 miles from his cabin. It was a piece of cheap paper, soaked by the melting snow and curling at the edges. The black ink had run, but the words were still stark and clear. Wanted. He swung down from his horse, his stomach tightening. He already knew. He ripped the poster from the bark. One runaway girl, stolen property. There was no name, just a description that was agonizingly precise. Dark hair, gray eyes, small build, a faint, puckered scar on her lower lip. A bounty was offered, $50. For her return, no questions asked. Luke stood there in the muddy, thawing forest, the wet paper in his hand. A cold, killing rage settled over him. It was the same rage he had felt when he'd crushed the cup, the same rage that had sent him outside to bloody his hands on the axe. But this was colder. This was a promise. Stolen property. The poster meant 2 things. 1, they knew where she had gone, at least generally. And 2, someone had been this close to his cabin, this close to her. The person who nailed this tree was either very brave or very stupid. Or they were just scouts, testing the water. He folded the poster, his movements stiff. He tucked it inside his shirt. He rode back to the cabin, his eyes scanning every shadow, every cluster of rock. The world, which had seemed so big and quiet, now felt small and full of eyes. When he returned, Annalise was by the fire, stirring a stew. She looked up when he entered, a small smile on her face. The smile vanished when she saw his. "What is it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Nothing," he said, his voice too flat. "Just a wolf track. Too close." He pulled his saddlebags off, his back to her. He could feel her watching him. She knew he was lying. Their shared silence had taught them to read each other too well. He was loud with tension, his jaw set, his shoulders tight. "You're hurt," she said, moving toward him. "Your ribs." "I'm fine." He shrugged her hand off, his movement sharper than he intended. She flinched, not in fear of him, but in hurt. She stepped back, her face closing, the light in her eyes dimming. She turned back to the fire. That night, he lay beside her in the cot, but he did not touch her. He lay on his back, staring into the dark, the poster a cold weight against his skin. He felt her lying beside him, equally still, equally awake, a foot of cold air between them. The next morning, he went out to chop wood. He took the poster from his shirt and, when he was sure she was inside, he laid it on the chopping block. He stared at the words. Stolen property. He picked up his axe and brought it down, splitting the paper, the wood, everything, in 2. He gathered the pieces and took them to the fire. He fed them to the flames, watching until every last word, every last description of her, had curled into black ash. He turned from the hearth. She was standing by the table, her hands clenched. She had been watching him. "What did you burn?" she asked. "Trash. Found it on the trail." "It was paper. Luke, you were reading it." He didn't answer. He went to his rifle and began to clean it. An unnecessary chore. The silence in the cabin was back. But it was not the healing silence of winter. It was the taut, terrible silence of an unburied body. It lasted for 2 days. On the 3rd day, Annalise broke. Luke was checking the cinch on his saddle, preparing to ride out again, to search for the man who had nailed that poster. "I'm leaving," she said. He froze, his hand on the leather strap. He turned slowly. She was standing by the door. She had her coat on, his coat, the one he had given her on that first ride. A small bundle of food, bread and jerky, was on the floor at her feet. Her face was pale, but her chin was set. She looked like the ghost he had first met. "What are you talking about?" "I'm leaving. I will not be the thing that gets you killed. Luke." "You're not going anywhere." You found something, didn't you, out on the trail? That paper you burned. It was about me. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. It was a bounty poster, $50. She closed her eyes, a small, pained sound escaping her. But when she opened them, they were dry. So he knows. Masterson, he knows I'm here. He knows you're in the territory. He doesn't know you're here. He will, she said, her voice raw. Men like that, they don't stop. They will follow the trail. They will find you. They will hurt you. And they will take me. She bent and picked up her bundle. I will go north, into the mountains. They won't find me. You'll die, he said, his voice flat. The passes are still snowed in. You'll starve or you'll freeze. You're not going. He moved to stand in front of the door. He was bigger than her, a solid wall of muscle and anger. She looked up at him, and her composure finally broke. Tears welled, but she did not let them fall. Please, Luke, don't make this harder. You saved me. You gave me... She stopped, unable to say it. You gave me these months. I will not be the one to destroy you for it. She tried to push past him. He grabbed her arm, not gently. She looked at his hand on her arm, and then up at his face. Her voice was ice. You didn't buy me to chain me. Luke, let me go. The words hit him like a physical blow. He let go of her arm as if she had burned him. He stepped back from the door. He watched her, his heart a cold stone in his chest. She thought he was just another man who would hold her, another man who would use his strength to keep her. I'm not chaining you, he said, his voice quiet, but rough with an emotion he couldn't name. You can walk out that door. You can go up into those mountains and die, if that's what you want. She hesitated, her hand on the door latch. But I won't let you go back to them, he said. I won't let you go alone. If you run, I run with you. If you stay, I stay with you. But you are not going back to that man. You are not property. She stood frozen, her back to him. And then, in the silence, came the sound. A single, sharp snap of a dry twig, just outside the cabin, down by the creek. Luke moved. He was across the room in a single stride, shoving her away from the door and grabbing his rifle from its pegs. Get down, he hissed. Get away from the window. He flattened himself against the log wall, his rifle up, his eyes straining to see through the small, greasy pane of glass. Annalise was pressed into the far corner, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. What is it? She whispered. Shh. He waited. The cabin was silent. The fire popped, and then he saw it. A rider. He was far off, on the crest of the southern ridge, the same ridge she always watched. He was just a silhouette against the pale spring sky. A dark, motionless shape. He wasn't moving. He was just sitting on his horse, watching the cabin, watching the smoke from their chimney. He was too far to be a threat. He was too far to shoot, but he was there. The poster had been a message. This was the follow-up. Luke lowered his rifle, but he didn't move from the wall. He watched the rider for a long, long minute. Then, the man turned his horse, slowly, and disappeared back over the ridge. The threat was gone, but the promise of it remained. Luke turned. Annalise had sunk to the floor. She was sobbing, not the loud, relieved sobs of the storm. These were the choked, terrified sobs of a trapped animal, the sobs of that first night. He found me, she gasped, rocking back and forth. He found me. I knew it. We don't know it was him, Luke said, his voice hard. It was just a scout. It was him, she screamed, her voice cracking. It was Masterson's man. You don't understand him. Luke, you don't know what he's like. She was hysterical, her past crashing down on her. He's not just a man. He's a demon. He told me he called me his investment. He said I was his finest piece." She was pulling at her hair, her eyes wild. "When he locked me in that room, it wasn't just to use me, it was to break me. He likes things that are broken. He said he enjoyed the hunt more than the prize. He told me he'd let me go, just so he could feel the thrill of catching me again. He knew I'd run from that saloon. He wanted this. He's not here for the $50. Luke, he's here for me." She was unraveling, the past she had kept buried for months erupting. "He'll kill you. He'll kill you just for touching me. He'll make me watch. He'll... Luke was across the room. He hauled her to her feet, his hands biting into her shoulders. She flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was a fierce, brutal, possessive kiss. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated rage. He kissed her with all the fury he felt for Masterson, for the poster, for the man on the ridge. He kissed her to silence her fear, to brand her, to stake his own claim. It was a promise, hard and violent. She was stunned into silence. Her sobs stopped. Her hands, which had been beating at his chest, clenched his shirt. She kissed him back, a desperate, hungry answer. He broke the kiss, but he didn't let her go. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. His eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. "He'll have to kill me first," he said, his voice a low, guttural promise. Her fear was gone, burned away by the heat of his... She looked at him, her lips swollen from his, her eyes clear. She nodded. They had to leave. They knew it. They had to be gone before that scout returned with others. They had hours, maybe only one. But in that moment, with the threat of death hanging over them, the air in the cabin was electric. It was not the desperate clinging of the storm. It was not the shy, healing touches of the winter. This was something else. This was two people, two equals, staring into the abyss and choosing each other. He didn't say a word. He just lifted her into his arms and carried her to the cot. They made love with a fierce, quiet desperation. It was not about fear. It was about defiance. It was a claiming. It was two people seeking something pure in a brutal, dirty world. It was a final, silent oath, spoken with hands and mouths and bodies. It was a desperate attempt to memorize each other, to find one moment of profound, simple truth before the lies and the violence came for them. It was a pledge that whatever happened, they belonged to each other, not to the past, and not to the men who were coming. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, the afternoon sun slanting across the floor. The cabin was quiet. "We leave at dusk," Luke said. His voice was steady. They began to pack, not with the frantic panic of before, but with a cold, methodical purpose. Flour, salt pork, coffee, ammunition, 2 bedrolls, all the cartridges he owned. Annalise worked beside him, her face pale but set. She was no longer crying. She was no longer the victim. She was a survivor, preparing for the next fight. When they were almost done, Luke went to the hearth. He took his knife and pried up one of the heavy, flat stones he had set years ago. Beneath it, the dirt was dark and packed. He dug his fingers in and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Annalise stopped packing and watched him. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a gun, a revolver, a heavy Colt, dark and well-oiled. It was not the pistol he wore on his hip. This one felt different. It felt older, heavier with history. He checked the cylinder. It was loaded. "The one from El Paso," she whispered. He nodded, his face grim. He tucked the gun into the waistband of his pants at the small of his back. Annalise watched him. She looked at the heavy rifle by the door. She looked at the pistol on his hip. She looked at the new, old gun he had just hidden. And she looked at her own empty hands. "No," she said. He looked up. "No what?" "I will not be the baggage. I will not be the property he's come to collect. I will not just run and I will not just hide behind you." She walked over to him, her eyes burning with a cold fire he had never seen before. "Teach me." "Teach you what?" "How to shoot. Teach me to use that." She pointed to the pistol on his hip. "If he comes for me, if they come for us, I will not be the one screaming. I will be the one fighting." Luke stared at her. He saw the woman he had first seen in the mud, the one with the hollow eyes. He saw the woman who had bound his ribs. He saw the woman who had cried in his arms. And now, he saw this new woman, the one with steel in her spine. He nodded, slowly. He unbuckled his gun belt and handed it to her. The weight of it surprised her, and she staggered a step. "It's heavy," he said. "You're not strong enough to hold it steady for long, but you're smart." They couldn't fire it. The sound would carry for miles. But he could teach her the mechanics. He stood behind her, his body pressed against her back, his arms coming around her to guide her hands. It was an intimate, deadly embrace. "This is the trigger," he said, his voice low in her ear. "You don't pull it, you squeeze it, gently, like you're crushing a berry. You pull it, you'll aim at the ground." He showed her how to draw the hammer back. The heavy click echoed in the small cabin. "You aim for the center of the chest, not the head. The chest is bigger." His arms were tight around her, his hands over hers, holding the gun steady, aimed at the far wall. "And you don't stop. You don't fire one shot and wait. You fire until it's empty, or he's down. Do you understand me?" She nodded, her body rigid in his arms. "Don't close your eyes," he said. "You look at what you're shooting at. You never look away." He stepped back. "Now you—" She raised the gun. It wavered, the barrel heavy, but she held it. Her eyes were fixed on the wall, her face a pale, determined mask. Luke watched her. She was not an angel. She was not stolen property. She was a woman, forged in fire, and she was holding a gun. He buckled the ghost gun on his own hips. "Get your bundle," he said. "It's time to go." They left the cabin at dusk, not looking back. To look back was to give the ghosts power. The cabin, which had been a fortress and then a home, was now just a marker on a trail, a place to be found. Luke had pushed the heavy door shut, and it had closed with a sound of finality. He had his rifle, the pistol on his hip, and the heavy ghost gun from El Paso tucked at his back. Annalise had the mare, Dusty, and the gun belt Luke had given her strapped awkwardly over her coat. It was too heavy for her, the pistol slapping against her thigh, but she refused to let him carry it. They rode west, not on the wide, easy trails that led to towns, but up into the high, dangerous country. Luke pushed them hard, his face a grim mask, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges behind them. He was a man of the high lonesome, and he moved through the thawing, treacherous canyons with a confidence that settled her nerves. He led them through narrow, rock-strewn passes where the wind tried to peel them from their saddles, and down into arid, sun-baked plains that seemed to stretch into forever. Their goal was California. Luke had spoken the name like a prayer. He had contacts near a place called Yuba City, men he had known during the war, men who owed him favors. It was a name, a direction, and for now, it was enough. For 2 weeks, they saw no one. They were ghosts in a vast, empty landscape. They ate sparingly, their meals cooked over small, smokeless fires of dry brush. They slept in their bedrolls, pressed close for warmth, taking turns on watch. Luke taught her. He taught her how to read the land, how to spot a loose rock that might mean a snake, how to listen for the sound of a horse that was not their own. He taught her how to handle the gun. She practiced drawing the heavy weapon, her arm aching, until the motion was fluid. She never fired it, but she dry-fired it at rocks and trees, squeezing the trigger, her face a mask of concentration, just as he had shown her. In that harsh, clean wilderness, she changed again. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath her skin, but it was matched by a new, hard strength. Her hands, which had been so soft, were now calloused from the reins. She no longer looked like a victim. She looked like a survivor. But the wilderness could not provide everything. Their flour ran out, their coffee was gone. The jerky was down to its last strips. They were low on ammunition. "We have to go down," Luke said one evening, staring at the flicker of their small fire. "There's a town, Red Butte. It's a hard place, but we need supplies." Annalise just nodded. "I'm ready." Red Butte was less a town than a wound on the landscape. It was a cluster of tents and ramshackle wooden buildings, baking in the haze of the arid plain. It smelled of dust, unwashed bodies, and despair. They rode in slowly, Luke's horse leading, Annalise's mare just behind. The moment they hit the main street, the world stopped. Every man, and they were all men, miners and drifters and teamsters, stopped what he was doing and looked. They stared at Luke first. He was hard, armed, and sat his horse with a stillness that promised violence. But their eyes did not stay on him. They moved to Annalise. It was not just her beauty, though she was beautiful. Her face flushed from the trail, her dark hair pinned beneath her hat. It was that she was a woman, and she was with him. The men leered, their eyes stripping her, their mouths twisting in silent, ugly appraisal. They saw a possession. They saw his property. Annalise stared straight ahead, her hands tight on the reins, her back rigid. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but it was the women, the few she saw, who hurt more. Two saloon girls, their faces painted in the harsh morning light, stood on a boardwalk. They looked at Annalise, at her fine, strong horse, at the protective way the man in front rode, and their faces hardened with a contempt that was sharper than any man's leer. They looked away, as if the sight of her was an insult. "Keep your head down," Luke murmured. "General store, straight ahead." It was not just a store. It was a saloon, a trading post, and a feed store all in one. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, cured hides, and human sweat. Luke moved to the bar, where a man was measuring out sacks of flour. "Need cartridges," Luke said, his voice flat. 44, and flour, coffee, bacon." Annalise stood by the door, her hand resting near the butt of the pistol on her hip. She tried to make herself small, to look at the floor, but the silence in the saloon was deafening. "That'll be $4, the bartender said, his eyes flicking to Annalise and back. A man at a table in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee, slowly lowered it. He was a thick-bodied man with a greasy vest and small, calculating eyes. He was not leering. He was studying her. His eyes moved from her face to her hair, and then, unmistakably, to the small, puckered scar on her lip. His gaze sharpened. He looked past her, to a piece of paper nailed to the wall by the door, just beside her head. Annalise saw the motion. She turned. It was the poster. One runaway girl, stolen property. Her blood went cold. She looked back at the man. He was smiling, a slow, ugly smile of recognition. Luke had seen it all. He dropped the coins on the bar, leaving the supplies. "We're leaving." He grabbed her arm and pulled her out the door. They were on their horses in a second, kicking them into a hard run, leaving the dusty street and the staring men behind. They rode for an hour, pushing the horses, their lungs burning. "He'll follow," Annalise said, her voice tight. "I know." "He's a bounty hunter. I saw his eyes. He wasn't looking at me like the others. He was adding—" "I know." They rode all day and all night. They didn't stop. They pushed west, into a maze of canyons and washes, the land broken and cruel. Luke was trying to lose him, using every trick he knew, doubling back on their trail, riding through shallow creeks to hide their tracks. But the man was good. Just before dawn, Luke pulled his horse to a halt. The sky was a pale, sick gray. They were in a narrow box canyon. The air was dead still. "He's still coming," Luke said. He had been listening, his head tilted, for the past hour. "He's close." He dismounted. "Take the horses. Go to the end of the canyon. Find cover. Take the rifle." "Luke." "Do it, Annalise, now." His voice was iron. She did as he said, her heart hammering. She led the horses, her own and his, deeper into the rocks. She found a thicket of brush and tied them, her hands shaking. She climbed a small rise, the rifle heavy in her hands, and looked back. Luke was standing in the middle of the trail. He had not taken cover. He was just waiting. His duster was pushed back. His hand was loose, near the pistol on his hip. He was a statue, waiting for the sun. She heard it then, the slow, careful clink of a horse on rock. The bounty hunter appeared at the mouth of the canyon, not 50 yards away. He was sitting his horse, a heavy shotgun resting on his saddle horn. He saw Luke and smiled, the same ugly smile from the saloon. "Well, now," the hunter called out, his voice oily and confident. "You've led me a fine chase, friend." Luke said nothing. "No need for this to get ugly. I just want the girl, $50 in my pocket, and you right away. That poster says no questions asked. I don't care what you did with her. Just hand her over." "She's not for sale," Luke said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air. The bounty hunter's smile faltered. "She's stolen property. Friend, that makes you a thief. I can take you in too, or I can just take your horse after I'm done with you." "Right away," Luke said. "There's no money for you here." "I see how it is," the hunter sneered. He was tired of talking. He began to lift the shotgun. It was over in a second. The man was fast, but Luke was faster. Luke's hand blurred. He did not draw the gun from his hip. He drew the heavy ghost gun from the small of his back. The sound of the shot was deafening, a flat, hard crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The bounty hunter looked surprised. He looked down at his chest, where a dark, spreading stain was blossoming. His shotgun discharged into the dirt. He swayed, and then pitched forward, falling heavily from his saddle. Silence. The canyon was absolutely still. The man's horse, spooked, ran back the way it had come. Annalise let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her hands were locked on the rifle, her knuckles white. Luke stood there for a long time, the gun still in his hand. He looked at the body. Then, slowly, he put the hammer back in place and tucked the pistol away. He walked over to the dead man and knelt, checking his pulse. He stood, his face unreadable. He looked up at her. "It's done." She scrambled down the rocks, her legs weak. She came to his side. She looked at the dead man. His eyes were open, staring at the gray sky. There were no tears in her eyes. There was no fear. There was just a cold, quiet emptiness. Luke went to his saddlebags and pulled out a small, folding shovel. He began to walk to a patch of soft dirt near the canyon wall. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Burying him." "Why?" "No man deserves to be left for the buzzards," Luke said, his voice rough. He began to dig. Annalise watched him. After a moment, she took the shovel from him. "My turn." They took turns, the scraping of the shovel the only sound. It took an hour. They rolled the body into the shallow grave without ceremony. As Luke pushed the last of the dirt over the man's booted feet, Annalise spoke, her voice flat. "He'd have dragged me back like a dog." Luke stopped, his shovel in the dirt. He looked at her. "He'd have tied my hands," she said, her voice dead. "He'd have put me on a rope and dragged me back, and he'd have smiled the whole time." She looked at the grave. "I'm glad you killed him." Luke nodded. He covered the grave, and they scattered rocks over it. They rode out of the canyon, leaving the unmarked grave behind, the sun just beginning to crest the horizon. They rode hard for another 2 days. putting as much distance as they could behind them. They were in a new land now. Drier, flatter. They were exhausted, the violence of the dawn gunfight hanging between them. That night, they made a small, cold camp. They sat by the fire, the tension so thick it was almost a third person. Annalise stared into the flames, her face pale. The killing, the escape. It had broken something loose in her. "I never told you," she whispered, her voice so low Luke had to lean in. "Told me what?" "About before Masterson." Luke stayed quiet. He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. "I wasn't an orphan," she said. "Not really. I was unwanted. My PA died in a mine collapse. My ma, she had 4 others. I was just another mouth. She gave me to her brother, my uncle." She picked up a small stone, turning it over and over in her hands. He wasn't kind. He had a farm. He worked me. When I was 12, he started." Luke's hand tightened on his stick. He said nothing. "When I was 14, she continued, her voice flat and emotionless. He sold me to a neighbor for the price of a mule. That man kept me for a year, and then he got tired of me. He passed me to a trapper, and the trapper, he lost me in a card game. I was just passed around, like a coin, like a piece of property. I was used up before I was even a woman." She finally looked at him, her gray eyes swimming with tears she refused to let fall. "When Masterson found me, I was working in a laundry. He seemed so kind. He used such fine words. I thought I was finally being saved. I thought I was something other than that, but I wasn't. I was just another investment." She dropped the stone. "I never thought I would feel anything but shame. I never thought I would be clean. I thought I was broken, something that could only be used and thrown away." She finished. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. Luke stared into the flames, his face a hard mask. He was thinking of the man he had killed, of Masterson, of her uncle, of all the men who had passed her around. The violence in his gut was a cold, hard knot. He looked at her. Her head was bowed, her shoulders slumped. She was waiting for his judgment, waiting for him to be disgusted. He reached out, his calloused fingers touching her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You're not broken," he said, his voice low and fierce. "They are." She stared at him, her lip trembling. A single tear finally escaped and ran down her cheek. He brushed it away with his thumb. That night, they lay in their bedrolls, side by side, looking up at the sky. The stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in a black cloth. They were close enough to touch. Annalise lay awake, thinking of his words. "They are." "I never thought anyone would choose me," she whispered to the stars. "Not truly, just for me." Luke turned his head, his face close to hers in the dark. He could smell the wood smoke in her hair. He could see the starlight reflected in her open eyes. "I didn't just choose you, Annalise," he said, his voice rough. "I found you." He reached over, his hand finding hers, and held it. They fell asleep like that, their hands clasped, 2 small, breathing souls under a vast, empty sky. The next day, the landscape changed. The arid plains gave way to rolling, grassy hills. They found a river, wide and green, flowing west. The air smelled of water and living things. Luke, who had been tense and watchful for weeks, finally let his shoulders drop. "We're close," he said. They followed the riverbank. In the late afternoon, they saw it. A quiet ranch, tucked into a bend in the river. It was small, just a cabin, a solid barn, and a few corrals. Smoke rose from the chimney. "This is it," Luke said. A man was on the porch, leaning back in a chair, a rifle across his lap. He watched them approach. His eyes narrowed. He was weathered, with a graying beard and eyes that had seen too much. As they got closer, the man's eyes widened slightly. He stood up. Slowly. "Maddox?" he said, his voice a disbelieving rasp. "Is that you?" "It's me, Elias," Luke said, swinging down from his horse. He walked toward the man, his hand out. The man, Elias, gripped his hand. "My God, it's been, 10 years? I heard you were dead, or in prison." "Neither," Luke said. "Not yet." Elias's gaze shifted to Annalise, who had dismounted and was standing warily by her horse. He took in her beauty, the gun on her hip, and the way she looked at Luke. He looked back at Luke. His face was hard, but his eyes were not unkind. "She's with me, Elias," Luke said simply. There was a warning in his voice. Elias nodded, his gaze softening. He had seen enough of the world not to ask questions that had no good answers. "I see that." "We're heading for Yuba City," Luke said. "We need a place, just for a few days. We've been riding hard." "You always were," Elias said. He jerked his head toward a small, well-kept cabin near the riverbank, separate from the main house. "The south cabin is empty. It's clean. Water's in the bucket." "I'm obliged, Elias." "You saved my life at Antietam," Elias said, as if that explained everything, which it did. "Get some rest, both of you. You look like you've seen hell." Luke nodded. He took the reins of both horses. He and Annalise walked to the small cabin. It was one room, with a real bed, a cold hearth, and a locked door. Luke pushed the door open. Annalise stepped inside. It was quiet. It was safe. She turned and looked at him, her eyes full of an exhaustion so deep it was a physical pain. He stepped inside and closed the heavy plank door, sliding the thick wooden bar into place. The sound of it locking was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The south cabin was a true sanctuary. It sat 100 yards from Elias's main house, nestled in a bend of the river, surrounded by tall cottonwoods. For the first time since Annalise had been pulled from that alley, there was no need to look over her shoulder. There was no man on the ridge. There was no snow blocking the door. There was only the sound of the river moving past, a constant, soothing rush that promised life. They slept for almost 2 days. It was a sleep so deep it was like a death, a shedding of the exhausted, hunted skins they had worn for weeks. They woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Elias had left a sack of supplies on their porch, a silent act of understanding. In the quiet that followed, Annalise began to heal. Elias was a man of few words, much like Luke, but his presence was a balm. He had seen the war, and he had seen the hardness of the frontier, and nothing about them shocked him. He treated Annalise not as damaged goods, but as a person. He gave them space, but he also gave them purpose. "The mare, Dusty," Luke said on the third morning. "She needs new shoes. I'm going to use your forge." "She's a good animal," Elias said, sipping his coffee. He looked at Annalise, who was sweeping the porch, her movements calm and measured. "But my own stock needs tending. I could use a hand, if you're willing." Annalise paused, her hands tightening on the broom. Her experiences with men and work were steeped in trauma. Elias seemed to read her mind. "The horses, ma'am, they're gentle. Just need brushing, the gray gelding through a shoe." She looked at Luke. He nodded. A silent message. "You are safe here." She put the broom down. "I can do that." She started in the stables. The air was warm and smelled of hay and leather. It was a comforting, earthy smell. Elias showed her the brushes, the curry comb, and left her alone. She approached the first horse, a calm-eyed bay, with hesitation. Her hands trembled as she first touched its flank. The horse just nickered softly and leaned into her touch. She spent the entire morning in the barn. Luke, hammering at the forge, watched her from a distance. He saw the tension slowly leave her shoulders. She began to talk to the animals, low, soft murmurs that the horses seemed to lean toward. She was gentle. Her hands, which had learned to grip a gun, now moved with a slow, soothing grace. "She has a way with them," Elias noted, stopping by the forge. "She has a way," Luke agreed, not taking his eyes off her. That afternoon, Elias led a gentle mare, already saddled, into the corral. "You ride," he said to Annalise. It wasn't a question. I rode here," she said. "You sat on a horse while it ran," Elias corrected, his voice not unkind. "I'll teach you to ride. A woman who can ride can choose her own direction." Luke stayed by the fence, watching. He leaned on the top rail, his arms crossed. Elias was patient, his voice low and steady. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to use her legs, how to sit the saddle not as baggage, but as a partner to the horse. Annalise was stiff at first, her body rigid with memory and fear, but the mare was steady, and Elias's instruction was clear. After an hour, she was guiding the horse in a slow, careful walk around the corral. "Good," Elias said. "Now, a trot. Just squeeze. Don't kick." She did. The horse jolted into a trot. Annalise, caught by surprise, lost her balance. She didn't fall, but she slipped, grabbing the saddle horn with a small, startled cry. The horse, sensing her imbalance, immediately stopped and turned its head, nudging her leg with its nose as if to ask if she was all right. Annalise looked at the horse's concerned, gentle eye. She looked at her own ridiculous sideways perch in the saddle. She looked at Luke, who was watching her with a small, worried frown. And then it happened. A sound bubbled up from her chest. It started as a small chuckle, a sound of surprise, then the absurdity of it, the gentle horse, her own clumsiness, the sheer, profound relief of being safe enough to be clumsy. It all hit her. She let out a laugh. It was not the small, shy smile he had seen before. It was a full, clear, genuine laugh. It was the sound of a spring thaw, the sound of a lock breaking. It was the most beautiful sound Luke had ever heard. He stood frozen by the fence, his heart aching in his chest. He was, in that moment, quietly and completely awed. He had seen her broken. He had seen her terrified. He had seen her fight. But this was the first time he had ever seen her free. He had known he wanted to protect her. He had known he desired her. But in that moment, watching her laugh in the sunlight, her face bright and unguarded, he knew he was lost. He loved her. The peace lasted for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of healing sun, hard work, and quiet nights. 3 weeks where Annalise's laugh became a more common sound, where Luke's shoulders finally unknotted from the years of solitude and running. They were building something, a fragile, quiet life. And then the world returned. It was late afternoon. The sun was heavy, casting long, golden shadows across the ranch. Annalise was walking back from the river, a full bucket of water in each hand. Luke and Ellis were on the far side of the corral, mending a gate, their hammers ringing in the clear air. The sound of riders came first, a low, drumming vibration. It was too fast for a casual visit, too heavy for a single rider. Luke looked up, his hand freezing on the hammer. He saw them, 5 riders, cresting the low hill to the east. They were not neighbors. They were riding hard, bunched together, a dark, menacing shape against the bright sky. "Annalise!" Luke shouted. His voice was a sharp crack in the peaceful air. "Get in the house! Bar the door!" She dropped the buckets and ran. Elias was already moving, sprinting to the main house, where his rifle was mounted over the door. Luke did not run. He walked, his pace deliberate, into the center of the ranch yard. He stood between the riders and the south cabin, where Annalise had just disappeared. He stood there, his duster pushed back, his hands loose. The 5 riders slowed, pulling their horses to a halt 20 yards from him. 4 of the men were hard cases, hired guns, their faces grim and dusty. But the man in the lead, he was different. He was thin, dressed in a fine, dark suit, despite the trail dust. His face was pale, his features refined. He looked like a preacher or a banker. But his eyes were as dead and cold as a snake's. It was Masterson. He completely ignored Luke. His cold gaze was fixed on the south cabin, where the door had just slammed shut. "Annalise, my dear," he called, his voice smooth and educated, carrying easily in the stillness. "Did you truly think you could run? My investment. It seems you have been mishandled." Elias came out onto the porch of the main house, his heavy Spencer rifle held loosely in his arms. He stood, a solid, silent presence. Luke finally spoke, his voice a low, flat growl. "She's not yours." Masterson turned his head, his eyes flicking to Luke with bored contempt. He looked at Luke's worn clothes, the gun on his hip, and dismissed him. "I am not speaking to you, sir. I am here to collect my property. That girl is a stolen asset, and you are a common thief." "She's a free woman," Luke said. Masterson chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "She is what I say she is. Now, hand her over, and I will overlook your part in this." "Refuse." He gestured to the 4 men with him, who were now fanning out, their hands resting on their holsters. "Refuse, and my associates will burn this ranch to the ground, starting with you and your friend." The air was still. A tense, terrible silence fell. Luke's hand was hovering over his pistol. Elias had raised his rifle slightly. The 4 gunmen were watching, waiting for the word. And then, the door of the south cabin opened. Annalise stepped out. She was not wearing the gun. She was wearing a simple cotton dress Elias's wife had left behind. She looked small and fragile and completely, terrifyingly calm. "Luke," she said. Her voice did not tremble. "It's all right." "Annalise, get back inside," Luke ordered, not taking his eyes off Masterson. "No." She walked past him, stopping only when she was 10 feet from Masterson's horse. She looked up at the man who had owned her, who had locked her up, who had sold her. She looked him directly in the eye. "You should not have come here, Mr. Masterson," she said, her voice clear. Masterson's smile was predatory. He was enjoying this. The fear, the control. "It is Master Masterson, my dear. You seem to have forgotten your manners, but do not worry. I will have ample time to teach you again." "I don't think so," Annalise said. "You locked me in the house on Willow Creek. It was for 11 months and 3 days. Masterson's smile wavered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Details. Now, come along." "You entertained guests," Annalise continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "You said I was for your special friends, to secure your investments." Luke's blood went cold. He took a step toward her, but she put a hand up, stopping him. Masterson's face was no longer smiling. His eyes had gone flat. "Be silent, girl." "I remember their names," Annalise said, her voice getting stronger. "Senator Albright, he liked me to cry. And Judge Hemlock from the circuit court, he liked to use his belt. And the banker from Philadelphia, Mr. Davies, he liked to watch." Masterson's face went white. The composure, the refined arrogance, it all shattered. This was not a runaway piece of property. This was a witness. This was his ruin. "You lying," he hissed, his hand moving. Luke saw the opening. He stepped forward, placing himself between Annalise and the horses. His hand was no longer on his gun. His arms were crossed, but the threat from him was a physical wave. "She's right," Luke said, his voice loud, carrying to Masterson's men. "She's told me every name, every date, every preference. And I've got to say, Mr. Masterson, your friends have expensive tastes." One of the gunmen looked at Masterson, his expression now uncertain. This was not a simple retrieval. "You try to take her," Luke continued, his voice like cold iron. "You try to silence her, and I will ride to every newspaper from here to St. Louis. I'll ride to the federal marshals. I will tell them every name she just said. I will tell them what a United States senator does in a locked room with a girl you bought for a mule. Your investment knows everything. And now, so do I." Masterson was trapped. He was breathing heavily, his pale face mottled with rage and, for the first time, fear. He looked at Annalise, and the hatred in his eyes was pure. He could kill her. He could kill Luke, but he couldn't kill the story. Annalise took a step back, moving to the porch of Elias's house. She bent and picked up the heavy Spencer rifle Elias had left leaning there. She didn't aim it. She just held it, the weight of it solid in her hands. She was no longer the girl with the sack over her head. She was no longer property. She looked at the man who had tried to break her. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice ringing in the silence. "Not ever again." The standoff was broken. The power had shifted. Masterson's hired guns were looking at him, then at Luke, then at Elias. They were paid for a fight. Not for a scandal that involved senators and judges. "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "Now." Masterson stared at Annalise for one long, murderous moment. He saw the rifle. He saw the look in her eyes. She was not the girl he had locked up. He had lost. He pulled his horse's head around, his movements jerky. "This isn't over." "It is," Elias called after him. "You ride this way again. You or any man you send. And my neighbors and I will hunt you down like the dogs you are. This is our land. There'll be war." Masterson didn't look back. He spurred his horse, and he and his men rode away, disappearing back over the hill, leaving only a cloud of dust and a profound, echoing silence. The moment they were gone, the rifle slid from Annalise's hands, clattering onto the porch. Her legs gave out. She sank onto the top step, her body trembling with the shock. Luke was at her side in an instant. He didn't touch her. He just knelt in front of her, his hands on his knees. He waited. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and then she let out a long, ragged breath. It was the breath she had been holding for years. She leaned forward, burying her face in his shoulder, and he finally wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. They just stayed there, breathing. The long run was over. Elias walked over, standing above them. "He won't be back," he said gruffly. "Men like that, they fear sunlight more than bullets. You exposed him." He looked at the two of them, huddled on his porch. "But you can't stay here. That south cabin, it's too open. He knows where it is." Luke looked up, his face grim. "We'll be gone by morning." "I didn't say leave." Elias said, "I said you can't stay here. I've got land upriver, about 5 miles. It's a high valley, sheltered by the canyon walls. Good timber, good water, only one way in. You're welcome to it. Build your own place. No one will find you there. No one will look." Luke looked at Annalise. Her face was still pale, but there was a new light in her eyes. A home. Their own. She nodded. They started the next day. They worked from sunup to sundown. Luke felled the trees, his axe swinging with a steady, purposeful rhythm. Annalise, her strength returned, helped him strip the logs and haul the stones for the hearth. Elias came with a team of mules to help set the main beams. They built it not as a fortress against the world, but as a home. It was small, just one room, but the walls were thick and the hearth was wide and deep. It was solid. It was theirs. Weeks passed. The summer heat settled into the valley. Their cabin was finished. It sat in a meadow of high grass, the river a silver ribbon below, the canyon walls rising like protectors on either side. That night, the first storm of the season rolled in. The wind howled, and the rain lashed against the new log walls. But inside, the cabin was warm, A fire blazed in the hearth they had built together. Annalise sat on the floor, on a bearskin rug Elias had given them. Luke sat behind her, his back against the wall, his legs on either side of her. She was leaning against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder. She was quiet, her fingers tracing the map of old scars on his forearm. She followed one, a long, pale line, up to his shoulder. She had seen his nightmares. She knew his ghosts. He had killed. He had a violence in him. But she was not afraid of it. It was the same violence that had saved her. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. Luke was silent for a long moment. He leaned his head down, his lips brushing her hair. He thought of the man he had been, the man who had walked into that muddy alley, the solitary, angry man who had built a fortress of silence around his heart. He thought of his life before her, empty, cold. He put his arms around her, holding her tightly against him. "You saved me too," he said, his voice rough. They held each other tightly as the storm raged outside, the wind screaming against the walls. But inside, in the cabin they had built, in the shelter they had made, it was warm. And though the world had tried to break her, the cowboy who lifted the sack saw an angel and never let her fall again. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment and tell us. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this, and let us know what you thought of Luke and Annalise's journey in English.